As has been announced by the president of this session, Professor Arun Kumar Mukherjee, the title of my paper is "Do Our Epistemic Intuitions Vary Across Culture?" Whatever the worth of this paper may be, I would like to dedicate this paper to the memory of my teacher, Professor Vishwabandhu Bhattacharya, whose centenary we have been celebrating in this last 1 year. This paper is about, some problems of doing cross-cultural philosophy. Many of us try to do cross-cultural philosophy, but while doing that, I have encountered some problems, and that is what I'm going to discuss today or bring to your notice. Maybe the discussion part will be taken up tomorrow. So all of us know, and it is about our concept of knowledge, and since human beings all over the world use certain concepts to understand themselves and their relationships with others, and the concept of knowledge is one such central concept, it has been assumed that there is, some kind of uniformity in our understanding of the concept of culture across different cultures. And that is, a very debatable point. The platitude is that all of us know about knowledge, and as Wilfrid Sellers once pointed out, that we would be different people if we were unable to categorize one another as knowing, communicating, acting, experiencing, or obligated. Yet, when we come to the notion of knowledge, we find that there is a surprising lack of unanimity amongst epistemologists regarding the understanding of this concept. And another thing is this, that epistemologists always thought that the way they have understood the concept of knowledge is the right way, and if the pre-theoretic epistemic intuition of common men does not tally with their definition of knowledge, then they can ignore that intuition. But what we are going to look at is that whether philosophical intuitions are also shared by common men or not. And as you all know, that the concept of knowledge which had been accepted till 1963 by the majority of Anglo-American epistemologists, right from the days of Plato, was that of justified true belief. And according to these epistemologists, a piece of knowledge, in the true sense of the term, must fulfill three conditions. Everybody knows that: the belief condition, the truth condition, and the justification condition. And of these three, only the third one is really the epistemic condition, the first two being psychological and the semantico-metaphysical, respectively. So most of the definitions of knowledge have been developed around the concept of justification. However, this concept of knowledge was seriously questioned, as you know, by Edmund Gettier, who showed with the help of a counterexample that an epistemic agent may form a justified true belief, yet he may fail to have knowledge. Ever since the publication of Gettier's paper, epistemology has been a battlefield of discarded counterexamples and counterexamples. And most of the major movements and innovations of the last 50 years of contemporary epistemological debates relied heavily on epistemic intuitions of philosophers as the substantive evidence for theories of knowledge. Rival epistemologists have used their simple thought experiments as their sharpest tool to demolish the views of their opponents. This holds true about the Jettiby thesis, the externalist theories of epistemic justification, as well as epistemic contextualism. And use of these thought experiments in different epistemic theories, we find, that have been based on a common assumption that the intuition of epistemologists that intuitions that epistemologists elicit are shared by all. If not, they ought to be shared by anyone who possess the concepts of knowledge and justified belief and the capacity of reflection on the correct application of those concepts. But we have seen that this methodology has been questioned, and having realized the sterility of this methodology, epistemologists have attempted to proceed, mainly in two different ways. Some of the approaches still moved around the concept of justification, but explained knowledge and justification in a different way. For example, Goldsman's reliabilism or John Tyrie's theory of ableism. And there are others who have given up the centrality of the concept of justification and followed in the footprints of W.V. Quine in offering different naturalistic theories. But how do we determine which of these approaches correctly grasp our intuitive understanding of knowledge? That is the main question. And to understand that, recently, a group of philosophers who call their enterprise experimental philosophy has adopted a different but controversial method. They proceed by developing some vignettes or cases, some short stories, to find out which of the philosophical intuitions are accepted by common men belonging to different cultures. They gather data from widely differing populations and try to find out through controlled experiments how ordinary knowers intuitively respond to those cases. Then, on the basis of statistical analysis, etc., they attempt to find out that common man's epistemic intuitions. So, I have been part of one such exercise, and I'm associated with one such group. So, from the inside, I have found some problems in the methodology of experimental philosophy or experimental epistemology, which I would point out slowly. So let's start by presenting how experimental philosophers have tested the so-called Gettier intuition. Stephen Stich and his associates have named the judgment that the agent does not have knowledge despite having a justified true belief, the Gettier intuition. So what is the Gettier intuition? Gettier intuition is the judgment that the agent may not have knowledge despite having a justified true belief. And Stich and his associates did pioneering work to determine whether lay persons possess the Gettier intuition or not. In a groundbreaking, influential article, Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich in 2001 reported evidence that the Gettier intuition varies across cultures. They reported that participants with Western cultural backgrounds agreed with philosophers that the relevant beliefs of protagonists in Gettier cases are not cases of knowledge, while a majority of participants with East Asian and South Asian cultural backgrounds took these beliefs to be cases of knowledge. On the basis of these findings, they argued that if these findings are true, then such cross-cultural variation would undermine the thesis that there is a common understanding of knowledge across cultures. However, in 2015, Edward Machury and others provided evidence that for at least some ways of eliciting the Gettier intuition, there is agreement among Americans, Japanese, Brazilians, and Indians. And I was associated particularly with this project. And from our data, actually, the paper that was published, there it was concluded that the Gettier intuition may well be the part of a core epistemology, a universal way of thinking about epistemic matters. In all those cultures, standard translation of knowledge referred to an epistemic state that differs from the mere possession of a justified true belief. But for that matter, we could not uphold that the concept of knowledge is universal, because people may think of the epistemic state referred to by the standard translation of knowledge differently in different cultures and languages. So I would just, by way of example, I would present to you one such case or vignette and the questions that was posed to the participants. So participants across 4 different cultures were presented with the following Gettier case, and it is known as the hospital case. So what was the story? That Paul Jones was worried because it was 10 p.m. and his wife Mary was not home from work yet. Usually she is home by 6 p.m. He tried her cell phone but just kept getting her voicemail. Starting to worry that something might have happened to her, he decided to call some local hospitals to ask whether any patient by the name of Mary Jones had been admitted that evening. At the university hospital, the person who answered his call confirmed that someone by that name had been admitted with major but not life-threatening injuries following a car crash. Paul grabbed his coat and rushed out to drive to University Hospital. As it turned out, the patient at University Hospital was not Paul's wife, but another woman with the same name. In fact, Paul's wife had a heart attack as she was leaving work and was at that moment receiving treatment in Metropolitan Hospital a few miles away. And after this story was presented to the participants, they were asked following 4 questions in fixed order. What were the questions? First was a binary comprehension question that according to the story, which of the following statement is correct? At 10 p.m., Paul's wife was in a hospital, and at 10 p.m., Paul's wife was in a movie theater. Participants who selected 2 were excluded from the analysis. This comprehension question was then followed by 2 different questions intended to examine whether participants shared the Gettier intuition, which are respectively called knowledge 1 and knowledge 2. And in between knowledge 1 and knowledge 2, there was a question about justification. So what was the knowledge 1 question? The question was like this: in your personal opinion, when Paul rushed out to drive to University Hospital, did he know whether or not his wife was hospitalized? The options were yes, he knew, and the second one was no, he did not know. The third question was that about justification, that how justified was Paul in thinking that his wife was hospitalized when he rushed out to drive to the University Hospital, followed by a 7-point scale ranging from completely unjustified to completely justified. So what were the items? That completely unjustified, Paul was completely unjustified, unjustified, somewhat unjustified, Paul was state of mind was neutral, or Paul was somewhat justified, Paul was justified, and Paul was completely justified. And so participants who selected, say 1, 2, 3, that is completely unjustified, unjustified, somewhat unjustified, were excluded from analysis since we were interested to find out who subscribed to the justified true belief thesis. And then the knowledge 2 question was posed, and it was this: that in your view, which of the following sentences better describes Paul's situation? So 2 choices given were: 1, Paul knew that his wife was hospitalized, and 2, Paul thought he knew that his wife was hospitalized, but he didn't actually know this. So then knowledge 1 and 2 were each followed by a question meant to probe participant certainty, and how certain are you of your response on a 0 to 100% scale, with low numbers indicating that you are not sure and high numbers indicating that you are sure. So the participants are to write that I am such and such person certain of my response. Participants who selected the second option to knowledge 1 case, that is Paul did not know, were scored as sharing the Gettier intuition as answers to knowledge 1. And participants who selected once again the second item to knowledge 2, that is Paul thought that he knew that his wife was hospitalized, but actually he didn't know this, also was scored as sharing the Gettier intuition when the answers to this knowledge 2 were analyzed. Now, number of our valid data was 521 from 4 different cultures, and our data indicated that by and large participants responded similarly to the questions. Americans, Japanese, Brazilians, and Indians all chose the second option to the knowledge 2 question. That is, most of them answered that Paul thought he knew that his wife was hospitalized, but he didn't actually know this is the correct answer. And we also found that Indian participants, especially who spoke Bengali, actually responded in a different way to the knowledge 1 question than the Americans, Brazilians, and the Japanese participants. So we found that the Bengalis answered that Paul knew in respect to the knowledge 1 question, while the Americans, Brazilians, and the Japanese actually strongly shared the Gettier intuition and said that Paul didn't know. So taken together, these findings, we find that for many Bengali-speaking participants, their concept of knowledge requires more than JTB because they answered or selected the second alternative in the knowledge 2 question. Though a substantial number of Bengali speakers, between 62.5% to 66.5%, said that the protagonists in the Gettier cases did have knowledge in response to the knowledge 1 question, we suspect that this can be explained by facts about the word commonly used to translate no in Bengali. In Bengali, it is no is not a justified true belief all the time. We do not hesitate to say that, yes, I knew it, but I knew it wrong. So we find that this verb jana in Bengali, which has been derived from the verbal root ja in Sanskrit, are used somewhat differently from to know in English. In particular, the distinction between to believe and to know is not always retained when jana and know are used, and as has been pointed out by Professor Sen, that we find that jnana has been classified into, say, anubhava and smriti, and then anubhava has been classified into, say, yathartha and ayathartha. So jnana may be both yathartha and ayathartha, which is not the case in English or in the Anglo-American tradition. So we find that in a majority of Bengali participants readily ascribed knowledge to the protagonist, who simply asked when the protagonist knows the relevant proposition. But at the same time, they said that Paul, or the protagonist, didn't know but felt that he knew when he rushed out to the hospital. Thus, we find that from our data, the verb jnana or jana may in fact express 2 rather different concepts in Bengali, one of which is closer to the concept expressed in English by know, and the other closer to the concept expressed in English by having some opinion, or maybe believes in as a as an episodic sense, not in a dispositional sense. So, though we have only looked at 4 cultures and 4 languages, they include quite different languages, and also from participants from different strata of society. And since all 4 cultures exhibited Gettier intuition, we concluded at that time that it is plausible to hypothesize that Gettier intuition may be a reflection of an underlying innate and universal core folk epistemology. But now I find this problematic, because when we had developed the cases or short stories or vignettes to determine whether people across cultures share any epistemic intuition by taking justification at the central epistemic concepts, we really have narrowed down the scope a lot. However, even within Western epistemology, we know that not all share the same concept of justification. Reliabilists, responsibilists, ableists, they define justification differently. And in post-Quinean epistemology, we find that Alvin Goldman actually offered a reliabilist notion of justification. And actually, his notion of knowledge had two levels. One is descriptive and the other is normative. At the descriptive level, an epistemologist takes stock of different belief-forming processes, which entitles one to claim that she or he knows if someone acquires a belief through visual or auditory perception, or remembers correctly some relevant information which he has acquired before, or arrives at a reasoned conclusion through an accredited process of inference, or has formed the belief on the basis of some expert's account, then an epistemic evaluator usually grants that the believer is justified in upholding such a belief. If, on the other hand, the believer had acquired a belief through, say, guesswork or wishful thinking, or by ignoring available contrary evidence, then the believer is not usually considered justified in holding certain belief. Why is it so? Goldman says that perception, memory, inference, authentic information are processes which are likely to yield more true belief than false beliefs, and hence all these are considered reliable or virtuous belief-forming processes. Any belief acquired through such reliable processes are deemed to be justified and a strong candidate for sources of legitimate knowledge claim. And next he raises the question whether the category of belief-forming processes can be expanded, say by including a process like clairvoyance or some other kind of extraordinary or extrasensory perception. He found that people are very conservative about this kind of categorical expansion. Even if in some rare cases a person is clairvoyant, common people or epistemologists are unlikely to expand or revise their list of epistemic virtues lightly or carelessly just on the basis of some extraordinary instances. And Goldman himself reminds us that reliabilism may not be the only account of epistemic justification. Some may offer a responsibilist theory, which characterizes a justified or rational belief as one that results from the product of epistemically responsible action. An example of irresponsible or culpable epistemic action may be the following. One young scientist, while making a presentation of his new thesis, ignores the criticism of a senior experienced colleague, though the criticisms were strong and sound. This is definitely an epistemically responsible act. But there are cases where it is not so easy to decide whether an act is irresponsible or not. Suppose a doctor exposes an infant to unnecessarily high concentration of oxygen, thereby causing severe eye damage. Suppose that this fact has already been reported in an obscure medical journal of which the doctor was not aware. Shall we then hold that the doctor was epistemically irresponsible? So these are the problems that surround this responsibilist notion of justification. Hence, depending on one's notion of justification, one would answer the question whether Paul was justified in his stance when he rushed out of his department. Thus, there remains the possibility that some people's intuitions are discarded right at the beginning because they answered unjustified in some cases, where others have chosen the response justified. And so, the third question, the way we had interpreted at the time, actually cannot be accepted. And this responsiblest account, and also the reliablest account of knowledge is a bit dicey, because we find that through experiments it has been established that knowledge does not require belief all the time. At least that is not reflected in the judgment of competent speakers. But adult Anglophones are found often willing to attribute knowledge without attributing belief. And there are cases where people attributed knowledge but denied belief. One such case was given by John Turey. Here, the participants in one study read about the story of Karen, a first-year university student taking an introductory science course. And Karen's text has taught her that the earth revolves around the sun. This, however, conflicts with what Karen's religious parents taught her when growing up, that the sun revolves around the earth. On the final exam for the science course, Karen encounters the question, true or false, the earth revolves around the sun, and Karen answers true. After reading the case, participants were asked whether Karen knows that the earth revolves around the sun and whether Karen believes that the earth revolves around the sun. And we found that the vast majority, say 85%, denied that Karen had this belief, though they attributed knowledge to Karen. So in these cases, there is a conceptual disconnect between knowledge and belief. And the second serious problem with reliabilism is that knowledge does not always require reliability. And it was found that when it was told to the participants that somebody's memory is unreliable and whether he knew certain facts which he heard, and when it was told to the participants that somebody's memory was reliable and he could remember what he was told, in both cases we found that people ascribed knowledge, ordinary people ascribed knowledge who were not corrupted by philosophical teachings. So ordinary knowledge attributions might not be based on information about reliability at all, but there is evidence that they are based on information about ability, and that is why when we find that somebody's answer is based on some guesswork, then people are more unlikely to attribute knowledge to that person in that case. But when actually it depended on their ability, they were attributed knowledge. And another, many have objected to the method followed by experimental philosophers, saying that the attempt to study epistemic intuitions by presenting this kind of short stories and posing questions on them are completely irrelevant. But I don't think that it is an unsound process, and this is a quite well-known process in Indian philosophy. We have seen that Sriharsha in 12th century had followed this method, and he also used to present short cases or vignettes to test the epistemic intuitions of his readers or interlocutors. And we find 4 such cases in Khandana, each with a contrast scenario. And these cases have been mentioned by Janardhan Ganeri in the Sophia volume on Bimal Krishna Motilal. The first case of this was that of the self-confident gambler. This gambler sees the closed fist of his opponent and is immediately convinced that the first fist contains exactly 5 shells. His conviction is a pure guess, but Sriharsha is careful to point out that the fact that chance is involved here does not allow us to respond that he does not really believe. For a farmer too is convinced that the scattered seeds will yield a crop, even knowing at the same time that chance events may intervene. And indeed, there are 5 shells in the closed fist, and therefore their conviction is correct. The implied contrast scenario was this, that where everything else is the same, except that there were 4 shells and not 5 in the person's fist, and therefore the gambler's conviction is misplaced. So would we ascribe knowledge in any of these cases? That is the question which I am raising, though Sriharsha said that these are not cases of knowledge at all. The second Sriharsha case is the case of deceived deducer. A deduction is made to the effect that a fire is burning on the far-off mountain based on the premise that a plume of smoke can be seen rising up above it. What is seen, in fact, is a plume of mist in the crisp early morning air. The premise is false. We are nevertheless to suppose that there is a fire, and the deducer is accurate in his firmly inferred belief that this is so. Sriharsha says that the inferential belief that there is a fire on the mountain does not fall into category of knowledge in such cases, that is, which are known as the Kutalingaka Anumitis. But Bimal Mishra Motilal was the first to point out that the second case has a structural resemblance to a standard Gettier case involving existentially quantified belief. Since then, other Indian examples have been found in the work of Dharmottara, the 9th century Buddhist philosopher, and an extensive Tibetan discussion has also come to light. In Dharmottara's example, a swarm of flies is taken as evidence that there is a piece of rotting meat. There is indeed meat there, but what looked like flies is in fact just black dust. So, would we ascribe knowledge in this case? A third Sriharsha case is the case of misprimed perceiver. A person spots a far-off creature and sees that it is a cow. The categorical perception is a result of the perceiver's exercise of an ability to distinguish cows from other quadrupeds by the visual cue of having a dewlap. In this case, however, visual cueing is achieved by a piece of cloth that hangs under the cow's neck, not the dewlap. Yet the perception is correct. So categorical perception is here non-inferential. The role of the visual cue is not to provide a premise in a deduction, but to trigger categorization. Sriharsha claims that the miscue undermines the perceiver's right to claim to know. And this example is very similar to the false lemma type of response to Gettier case. A fourth and final Sriharsha case is the case of lucky listener. An entirely unreliable witness reports that there are 5 flowers on the bank of the river, and indeed there are. A second witness, this one is wholly reliable, makes the same report, and here Sriharsha explicitly describes a pair of contrasting scenarios, and in the first scenario he seems to suggest the listener has true belief but not knowledge. In the second, the listener knows the reported fact. The point is that merely believing what one hears, even when true, is no way to know. So we find that these are the 4 problematic cases which are mentioned by Sriharsha. One may construe these cases in the reliabilist line and say that all the cases are generated by sources which are not accredited or are vitiated by some defect. Sriharsha, however, has mentioned another possibility following Udayana, where the underlying intuition is knowledge is nothing but knowing a thing as it is accurately. And there we find that to know that P, one must have a true belief that P and other true beliefs in some way aligned with that belief that P. That is a condition one should add to true belief is additional collateral true beliefs. Other true beliefs turned in the same direction and thereby providing an assurance. And this has been named by Ganeri the assurance theory of truth. And this assurance theory, you can understand, in this case, this assurance is somewhat different from justification. And assurance are derived from the same sorted experience, that is to say, the acquaintance with the particular details that settle the question of the existence of an epistemic glitch. That is, the assurance is derived from what is known as todjatiyotva. So if we find that there is this todjatiyotva present, and then we get further assurance in favor of our perception or memory. But if it is not there, then it is not a case of knowledge. Gangesha, however, disagrees with Sriharsha and says that we are not to search for any additional condition over and above having true belief. According to Gangesha, knowledge is a matter of hitting the target, winning the prize, and how one came to do it or whether one could repeat the feat does not change the fact that one has won. And I have repeatedly asked my Pandit Mashai that when in this case of Kutalinga Anumati, the conclusion can be taken as a case of knowledge, he has said repeatedly that since this is a case of Tadvati Tatprakaraka Anubhava, whether it is generated by the pramana or not, that doesn't matter. And so we find that here the Novanaya tradition was actually giving us a theory of knowledge which is not of justified true belief for sure. And Motilal, on the other hand, maintains that the neo-Nyo epistemology is somewhat different from the commonly accepted notion of knowledge in the Western tradition. Why? Because he said that while we are talking about knowledge, we must have some sort of, say, second-degree warranty in our mind to claim knowledge in that case. And he said that actually term know can be interpreted in two ways. In the weak sense, in which it applies to any truth-hitting episode, and in a strong sense, in which it applies just to those truth-hitting episodes which constitute one's identity as an epistemic agent. And so we find that here the question of justification is not at all involved. And Janardhan explained Motilal's stance as follows, that for Gangesha, a truth-hitting episode or a true awareness already amounts to knowledge. When Motilal, by contrast, affirms that a knowledge event is a true awareness which is not infected with a dubious attitude, he is formulating what I have ascribed as an assurance theory of knowledge, with now assurance consisting in second-order certitude. Second-order certitude is another piece of information without being information about the origin or provenance of knowledge. It is true. It is the true belief that one has a true belief. It is sort of epistemic self-confidence. And lack of such self-confidence destabilizes one and one's epistemic orientation. To quote from Motilal, if an awareness which happens to be true is infected by a doubt about its knowledgehood or the lack of it, then the resultant state cannot perform all the functions that a piece of knowledge is supposed to perform. For example, making deductions with that piece of knowledge as a premise. So he will not say that this Kuttalingaka Anumiti is a case of knowledge. Another problem is this, that not only justification, but the belief part is also problematic in the Indian epistemic scenario. Here, Proma is to be analyzed not as true belief at all, but as a true awareness episode. And therefore, we find that we can raise in the context of Proma certain questions which are not raised in the context of knowledge. Proma as a cognitive event has a causal history, and when one asks if a given cognitive event is Proma or not, it is natural to seek an answer in the form of a causal explanation. And therefore we find that even though there are certain short stories which are present in the Indian scenario, which has been discussed by the Nayayikas and in response to Sriharsha, and Sriharsha in response to the Buddhists. But there we find that the concept of knowledge is not of, say, justified true belief at all. And so whether the Gettier intuition is possessed by the Indian philosophers or not, that can't be answered so easily. We have to look at the underlying theories, we have to look at the cultural practices, and also the understanding of the common people, and then only we can say whether we are sharing the same epistemic intuition across culture or not. Otherwise, whatever may be our, say, strength on the basis of, say, statistical analysis and on the report of these kind of experimental epistemologists, we cannot conclude that our epistemic intuitions are culturally invariant, but rather we have the tendency to say that our epistemic intuitions really vary across cultures. Thank you. Hope I have finished in time. Sure.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee, for this wonderful paper, and especially thanks for the clarification. I put this in context. Anand Vaidya, who may say something to this too, and I worked on a paper for the conference on experimental philosophy in Kanazawa, in Japan last year. And we looked particularly at your work too, and we were a little bit puzzled and a little worried also that the sample was among middle class Bengali literati, basically, that was number one. That what would it be like right across India, say South Asia, really, I mean, they would cover Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and so forth as well. So the population was very small to draw from. That was one thing. But the bigger puzzle for me in that was really taking at that very point on face value that whole commitment to justified true belief, the JTF. When back in 1985, Professor Matilal had generated, and Professor Mohanty, this debate with Karl Potter, who was one of the big protagonists of JTF, being read into Indian philosophy, into Indian epistemology. You remember we had a whole issue on Journal of Indian Philosophy, and I had a contribution as well, where I thought we had sort of kind of dealt with it then, and we'd set aside JTF and say it really should not come back, in that way. And of course, the Gettier problem was one of the ones that we discussed and discarded, and you cite rightly Professor Matilal on that. But several people, Prabal Dai as well, had worked on that. So I was a little surprised that in that experiment that Stephen Stich and company had started, why justified true belief was again taken so seriously at that point. But now, of course, as you've clarified, and the criticism that Anand and I had made was precisely along the lines that you've said. So it's really heartening to hear that. And I think maybe we could do another kind of experiment that would be more broadly representative of what's going on, because we don't know yet now, what exactly goes on in people's minds, as it were, on this.
Yeah, I'll just say a little bit more about that. So yeah, I was very happy to hear that basically what you just read is consistent with exactly what we just finished writing about 6 months ago on this issue. So two criticisms that I have in general that don't have to do with the territory already covered are this. If the initial study didn't replicate, why should I believe now that the second study is a good study? I mean, there's already a debate in their camp about the importance of replicating studies in experimental philosophy. So we ought to be looking for another study of the size of the second study that replicates well to believe that the second study was good, given that the first study didn't replicate, right? So that's the first point, methodologically, I would say. And then the second one, I would think also, is that it seems like there is a diversity of across the different languages in the second study, because you use Brazilian, Japanese, Bengali, and English, but there's a lot more languages that we could be studying and looking at. So it seems like, again, I don't know exactly how to analyze the statistical inference that's going on here, but it does look like sample size-wise, in terms of linguistic diversity, you would want more. So those are just two generic things. But again, I would agree with Professor Villamoria that, yeah, your analysis is exactly in line with the criticism we basically finished writing. So thank you.
So I didn't know about your criticisms, but actually what I thought that since they were seriously promoting these kind of philosophy, I should associate myself, and after only going through that exercise, I could find out the fault lines there. And as you have pointed out, that the first case could not be replicated. So why should we look at the second one? But in the one that 2001 case that could be replicated, and also, you know, now this in this Journal of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, there is a dedicated issue on experimental philosophy, and there actually say we have looked at 23 languages, and from 23 different countries and 23 different languages. And the conclusions also, we find that there is get your intuition, but it is actually sometimes it is affected by the, say, the order of presentation. Sometimes it is affected by, say, choosing the incorrect, say, word, or choosing words which do not fall on the same category and things like that. But 23 languages have already been studied. But still, you know, I had this belief that this justified true belief, we are starting from there, and then we are actually putting everything else into this particular grid, and therefore we are getting these results. So we will have to proceed differently if we are to do experimental epistemology seriously.
Thank you, Professor Sen.
The question.
No, this is just a query. How can one, you see, be sure that the same thing is being properly translated in different languages? Translation always poses a major problem, that whether it is an exact translation. Take, for example, the two verbs in German, kennen and wissen. Often in Bengali you will say, ami take jani, or ami take chini. But often you say, sometimes I always have this feeling that knowledge is not represented by jana. Prama comes quite near to
yes,
it.
That is
jana and knowing, I don't think one should conflate them. That creates problems.
That is, but commonly we do not use, say, proma in Bengali or Hindi or any other Indian languages in the common parlance. And so it has been translated jana, and it has once again been retranslated. And the languages that we have studied had gone through this rigorous process of translation, retranslation. And so if we set aside that translation issue also, we find that there is this basic problem that the intuitions are really converging or not. And if they don't converge, then even if we have 100% correct, accurate translation, our conclusions are going to be faulty.
Among 23 languages you said, how many Indian languages?
No, 23 different languages. From India, only Hindi and Bengali.
might I ask a question? I was actually intrigued by the discussion of two senses of jana, the Bengali equivalent of no, that there is a factive sense of the word and there's a non-factive sense of the word. What I was wondering whether you mentioned, which was very interesting, was that both the non-factive sense does not really pick out a dispositional mental state. So one question is whether it's similar to, for example, the non-factive uses of no that Alan Hazlitt has written about, or whether it is similar to think, like bhaba, which is, I'm not sure whether it's always dispositional or non-dispositional. So I was wondering about the linguistic data, or if there has been any experiment to test that dispositional, non-dispositional aspect of the data.
Not in the context of Indian languages, and I sometimes, wanted to translate it not but bhaba and not with bishash. Okay.
So time is running out. I invite the next speaker, Dr. Laura Guerrero, to present her paper. 15 minutes more. Right.
5 minutes. 1 o'clock. Up to 12:45, 55.
No, later to jabe na.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm not sure how much time we have.
12:45. Say you have 40 minutes.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So today I want to consider the possibility that Stiramati's commentary to Vasubandhu's 30 verses constitutes a defense of Buddhist global fictionalism. While no one has explicitly argued for this position as far as I know, several people have suggested this to me in response to other criticisms I have made to other Buddhist global fictionalisms. In Gould's 2007 and Zohar's 2017 characterizations of Stiramati's position as a pan-metaphorical account of language are strongly suggestive of the view. So this is what I would like to explore today. So what I'm going to offer today is, I guess, an example of one way of doing comparative philosophy is I will be bringing the philosophy of Vasubandhu and Stiramati into conversation with contemporary discussions about fictionalism and see how those two things fit together as using fictionalism as an interpretive strategy for this particular Buddhist thinker. So I want to start off by outlining Stiramati's goal in his commentary as they are understood by Zohar and Gould. Zohar explains that Stiramati is interested in providing a systematic account of meaning that is consistent with Yogacara metaphysical commitments and yet robust enough to resist the radical conventionalism of Madhyamaka Buddhism. According to the Madhyamaka Buddhism, all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, which is to say that they do not ultimately exist, but exist only conventionally as conceptual constructs. All language and thought, which can operate only with respect to such conventions, is not about anything real on this view. Zohar argues that Stiramati is for the most part in agreement with Madhyamaka about this, but disagrees about the implications for language and meaning. So Vinitadeva, in a sub-commentary to Stiramati's commentary, explains against the Madhyamaka claim that consciousness is also but a mere convention, that, quote, a convention without a support is logically untenable, since any designation is done in reliance upon something with all certainty, because otherwise, in the absence of any restriction with respect to meaning, there will be the unreasonable consequence of designating everything as everything. Zohar explains, quote, the very principle of conceptual differentiation allowed by referential language, the principle according to which certain names designate certain objects and not others, hinges on the presence of underlying extra-linguistic restricting conditions, end quote. The idea here is that conventionalism cannot be all-encompassing. The very fact that we use language in normatively constraining ways suggests that language has a basis. And in order for the language used specifically by the Yogacara to defend their particular soteriological project, in order for that language to be meaningful and true by some non-arbitrary standard, they seem to be they should be able to give an account of language that provides some sort of objective support. So this is what Stiramati is attempting to do in his commentary, at least that's the way it's characterized by Zohar and Gold. So both, and metaphoricalism is going to be the answer to this. So both Gold and Zohar argue that Stiramati in his commentary on Vasubandhu's 30 verses interprets Vasubandhu as claiming that all language is upachara in the sense of being metaphorical. Appealing to a standard Shastric definition of upachara, which in its most basic form defines it as occurring whenever the primary referent of a word is absent from the locus of reference. Stiramati argues that since, as the Yogacara argue, there are no real objects or subjects to serve as the reference of language, language involving apparent reference to selves and things, which is to say all language, can never be used in a primary sense to designate those objects. Instead, language, if it is to be meaningfully used at all, must be used only in a secondary figurative way to indicate or to indirectly refer to something else that is real. For Stiramati, this is going to be the transformation of consciousness. As both Gold and Zohar point out, Stiramati explains his view by appealing to a stock Shastric example of linguistic metaphor, that of calling a Bahika person an ox. This is an example of metaphor because the term ox in its primary usage directly denotes an ox. And in the example, there is no ox in the locus of reference. There is rather a person. If this statement is not to be understood as simply false, but rather as being apt or true in some way, then the term ox should not be understood as having its primary meaning, but as having a secondary meaning that serves to indirectly denote the person in a figurative way. In just the same way, argues Stiramati, the self and things that serve as the direct objects of language are always absent in the locus of reference, which for Stiramati is the transformation of consciousness, so consciousness itself. Similarly then, if statements made using the various terms for self and things, which is to say all language, are not to be understood as universally false mistakes, but rather as being in some sense truth-apt or correct or appropriate or assertable, then the various terms for self and things should not be understood as operating through their primary meanings, but only through their secondary meanings, which serve indirectly to denote consciousness in a secondary or figurative way. Furthermore, Stiramati goes on to explain that unlike primary literal uses of the term, which purportedly denote by identifying its referent as being of a particular nature, so for example, identifies an ox as an ox-natured thing, figurative uses of a term denote by means of experienced qualities. So in the above example, it is not with respect to the person's nature, which couldn't be that of an ox, that the term ox is aptly used to describe them. Rather, the person is indirectly denoted on the basis of certain qualities that they exhibit, such as being strong and slow-witted. Similarly, for Stiramati, all language in its figurative use indirectly denotes by way of exhibited qualities and not by way of the inherent nature of its referent. No such nature need be posited or known in order for figurative language to operate. In fact, the notion that there is a thing with its own nature to which qualities belong is a mere product of the imagination. According to Stiramati, all that we ever cognize are qualities and what might be better described as qualitative appearances, nirbasa, that are reified as properties of independent objects. These objects, however, do not exist as they appear, just as the floating hairs that appear to a person with eye disease are only apparent and not real. To use another of Stiramati's examples of upachara, so too the self and things that appear in cognition of ordinary unenlightened beings are only apparent and not real. What does exist, however, is consciousness, or the transformation of consciousness that underlies them. So the transformation of consciousness consists in a dependently originated and continuous flow of mental representations that constitute our phenomenal experience. This is the Yogacara view. This transformation of consciousness, along with its phenomenal content, arises in dependence on a storehouse consciousness that serves to incubate and process the continual flow of impressions left behind by experiences and volitional actions. So this is karma and vasana, of sentient beings that remain trapped in the beginningless cycle of samsara. The goal of Yogacara practice is to transform the nature of experience by engaging in practices that transform the impressions of the storehouse until eventually the storehouse itself is destroyed and the direct realization of the ultimate is achieved. However, until the moment of realization, the storehouse continues to generate the dualistically structured experience of subjects standing against objects that is the transformation of consciousness. On this account, the operations of consciousness, on this account of the transformations of consciousness, it is the apparent contents that arise in cognition that serve as the qualities of the transformation of consciousness on the basis of which language figuratively denotes it. Zohar explains that what Stiramati has done is exchange reference to objects for reference to, quote, the mental appearances of objects in their capacities as the transformation of consciousness, end quote, such that, citing an example by Gold, the sentence, there is an umbrella, really amounts to, quote, the transformation of consciousness is in a state such that it's like there is an umbrella, end quote. In connection with this claim, Gold explains that, quote, we have no need of real umbrellas if we know that umbrella refers to a set of experiences from the past. We refer to umbrella just as easily as we refer to, for instance, our hunger, when we name correctly based on experienced qualities alone, not on some real object in which those qualities inhere, end quote. Here, Gold highlights that not only does language universally operate as figurative language does by way of experienced qualities, but also that like all figurative language use, the norms of correctness are determined with respect to the occurrence of these qualities and not on the basis of the existence of directly denoted objects. So on this view, the primary reference of words are empty and unreal, like cases of upachara, but the usage of words is supported and constrained by the real underlying transformation of consciousness to which these words ultimately but indirectly denote. So this pan-metaphorical account of language shares certain structural features with a particular kind of fictionalist account. So this is going to be my reconstruction of what this account would look like if it was a fictionalist one. So fictionalism is commonly and generally characterized as the view that accepts discourse in a particular domain for reasons independent of its truth, and that takes the appropriate attitude towards such discourse to be something other than belief. The view is described as fictionalist because of an analogy with fiction, which is thought to share these characteristic features. Participants in fiction accept fictional claims without taking them to be or expecting them to be true, and without thereby believing them. The idea behind fictionalism is that the same insulation from truth and belief can be at play in other areas of discourse besides fiction. This view is often motivated what Yablo 2001 calls the predicament. Quote, we use discourse involving the existence of such and such, but don't believe such and such exists, end quote. So that's the predicament. So taking any particular discourse involved in the predicament to be fictionalist is one way of getting around any ontological commitment to the disputed entity. If the discourse is acceptable on grounds independent of its truth, and the claim's not meant to be believed, then the discourse is ontologically non-committal in the same way that Sherlock Holmes' discourse seems to be non-committal. So it's worth noting here that fictionalism is usually employed in localized contexts. So people who are anti-realists about mathematical objects or abstract objects might use fictionalism in order to explain why, for example, our discourse or talk about numbers, we can continue in talking in ways that seem to presuppose that there are numbers without actually committing ourselves to the existence of numbers. It is also worth noting at this point that there are two ways to understand and employ fictionalism as an interpretive strategy. The simplest way is to take fictionalism simply as a descriptive account. So any discourse would count as a fictionalist if it is not interested in truth, and if the appropriate attitude towards claims of that discourse is something other than belief. If we're looking at it as a purely descriptive account, it does seem that Stiramati's account does fit. However, another way to use fictionalism, and I think the more interesting way in my opinion, is an explanatory account. Such fictionalisms attempt to draw an analogy with the semantics or pragmatics of fiction in order to explain the semantics of a discourse that can be described as fictionalist. Here, the issues of interest often concern questions about how a discourse is possible, how it can be useful, empirical, and normatively constrained, despite making reference to ontologically problematic entities. And importantly, in its attempts to do this without resorting to a reductive explanation. So one difference I think that's important here is that fictionalists don't want to reduce the problematic entities into something else. So it's not like, oh, numbers are really something else. Rather, they want to say, no, numbers aren't real, and then give another alternative explanation about why we can use them in normatively constrained ways. But we can't just add 2 and 3 together and equal 7, there's a constraint. So how do we explain that? How do we apply mathematics to the real world, to the empirical world? That's another question. So how do we answer those questions, right? There's an explanatory story to tell, and if fictionalism is going to be a robust sort of interpretive strategy, I think you're going to have to appeal to that more explanatory account. So Stier-Matty's use of the Shastic account of metaphor as upachara, which grounds the metaphorical usage of language to a referential base, is suggestive of a kind of explanatory fictionalism that draws on accounts of fiction and metaphor, and like the one offered by, for example, Kendall Walton, that explicitly ground fictional usage of language in real-world conditions. So Kendall Walton, who I'm going to draw on here, and several other explanatory fictionalists have done so, is trying to explain how it is that fictions work by grounding them in real-world conditions. And it seems like something similar is going on in Stier-Matty, at least the way he is described by Zohar and Gold. So in particular, these accounts explain the normativity of fictional discourse, i.e. the norms concerning what is to be pretended or imagined in a given domain, by appealing to generation principles or rules that generate fictional discourse on the basis of real-world conditions. So the basic structure is that you have a generation principle is a rule belonging to a particular kind of fictional discourse. Then you have a prop, which is the real-world condition, the obtaining of which triggers the operation of the rule. And when the real-world conditions of the props obtain and you apply the rule, the result is a fictional state of affairs that is what is to be imagined, or whatever the appropriate attitude is to take towards these claims in that discourse. And we can think of the set of all fictional state of affairs generated by the generation principles of the discourse to constitute the fictional domain for the discourse, and determines what it is fictionally true or acceptable or correct for that domain of discourse. So it's this idea that there's these props, you have these principles, and you get your fiction. So one way to construe, so what I'm employing or exploring in this paper is that if we're going to try to employ this structure in Stier-Matty, what would it look like? What would serve as the props that would then generate this fictional discourse? So one way to construe Stier-Matty's account as a fictionalist account of this kind is to take karma, etc., as the props, and the storehouse consciousness as functioning as the generation principles, and the transformation of consciousness along with the imagined content to be the resultant fictional state of affairs. So on the causal story I explained before, you have the alaya vijnana with all of its karma and vasana, and it sort of processes this karma. So you can think about that process as like the operation of these generation principles, and what the result is the transformation of consciousness, which includes, as part of it, the appearances of subject and object, and that would be the fictional domain, right? What appears in the transformation of consciousness. This construal is suggested by Zohar when he claims that, quote, a word's actual referent, that which it designates figuratively, is not an object, but rather the entire causal process that makes the object appear in our consciousness, the underlying real ontological causal nexus that brought about the mental appearance of an object and its corresponding designation, end quote. So the whole causal nexus in this case would involve the entire process that generates the appearance of subject and object in consciousness, along with the designations, the seeing as the structures that structures those appearances. The problem that I see with this construal is that it undermines the view by transforming fictionalist generation principles, which are thought of initially as rules, into causes. On this construal, the generation of the fictional content that is part of the transformation of consciousness is causally and involuntarily generated by the storehouse consciousness. The involuntary nature of the generation of cognitive content is problematic for a fictionalist interpretation because it transforms the generation principles from rules to causes. For the fictionalist account, the generation principles are rules to be followed, rules that it should be possible to break. If it is in virtue of these rules in conjunction with real-world conditions that there is a fact of the matter about what is to be imagined as part of the imaginative discourse, in addition to these facts, however, In order for participating in an imaginative discourse to be normatively constrained, it must be possible to participate incorrectly and to have performances corrected. But if the props in the form of karmic forces and latent impressions are conceived of as causes of cognitive content, then that content can never be criticized for failing to conform to the rules of generation. All content will turn out to be appropriately fictional simply in virtue of being caused. What is thought and what is to be imagined turned out to be the same thing. The only error possible in this scenario would be one of attitude, of mistakenly believing what one should only be pretending or imagining, or whatever the appropriate propositional attitude is there. But if what is to be imagined is exactly whatever one happens to think, then the result is the worst kind of subjective relativism. The norms at the level of content that fictionalism was intended to supply are lost. So I worry about trying to interpret this as a fictionalist account given the very strong sort of causal underpinnings of the view. So another possible construal of Stier-Matthi's view that takes the transformation of consciousness itself to provide the props in the form of qualitative appearances. So in this version, the appearances that are arising in the transformation of consciousness, the nirbasa, those are what are the props, and the generation principles are going to be whatever formation rules we follow to generate a resultant fictional state of affairs. This would seem to fit with Zohar's claim that different people at different stages of progress along the Buddhist path will vary in how they imagine the world to be. This could be described as different people employing different generation principles and thus engaging in different imaginative activities on the basis of the same props. They, to put it in Zohar's terms, refer to the same underlying causal nexus, but they do so by imagining different fictional things on its basis. So the common referential real-world conditions supporting the different imaginative states of affairs make it possible for participants of different games to coordinate their imaginings, which, as Zohar notes, would help address concerns about incommensurability between different people at different stages of progression along the Buddhist path. So to give an example, with respect to the umbrella example I cited earlier, the claim that is an umbrella is acceptable or to be imagined in virtue of being generated by a generation principle or rule, such as when engaging in conventional discourse, this is if the transformation of consciousness is such that umbrella-like qualities are experienced, then imagine there's an umbrella. And this can be contrasted to, for example, somebody who's further along the stage in the path, and they might have a different generation principle that goes something like this. According to the discourse of the Yogacara Shastra, if the transformation of consciousness is such that umbrella-like qualities are experienced, then imagine that the evolving activity of the 8 modes of consciousness is such that it is like there's an umbrella. So Zohar describes this as a difference between a sense and reference of a term, so different people experiencing the same appearances, in this case, the appearance of umbrella-like qualities, can refer to the same thing, which would be the similar underlying causes that are generating the appearance of umbrella-like qualities, but have a different sense in light of having different sort of implicit understandings of the causal descriptions that explain the experience. So the unenlightened think umbrella-like appearances are caused by umbrellas. The enlightened know better. Or so that's the view that we see coming out in Zohar. So could it be possible to shift the props to the appearances themselves, have those be shared across people, and the generation principles just involve how we understand those appearances as they show up in the transformation of consciousness? There are several problems with the second fictionalist construal that concern the status of the appearances in the transformation of consciousness that are supposed to serve as props. On the view just sketched, different occurrences of the transformation of consciousness, either across the different mental continuums or within the same mental continuum at different times, can have the same apparent qualitative content. They are thus understood to have type-identical content on the basis of which, depending on the generation principle followed, the conventional world is imagined. It is this similarity that allows for coordination among people, in particular among people at different stages of the path, who may imagine different things, might imagine the world differently. Because their imaginings proceed on the basis of the same props, the qualitative appearances and cognition, they can still communicate and coordinate activities despite experiencing different imagined worlds. However, if Stiramati's view is to be a pan-figurative view, then it cannot be the case that the qualitative appearances given in cognition are conceptualized and meaningful, because that would involve the kind of linguistic categories that the account is intended to explain. So if the apparent content is taken to be conceptually structured, then it would seem that on the global view, that apparent content would itself be subject to fictionalist norms, and a problematic regress ensues. So part of the problem here is that Zohar and Gold offer an intentional description of the apparent content of cognition. So for example, Gold describes a cognition as displaying umbrella-like qualities without explaining the intentionality of that. Are we to understand this apparent content to be simply given in cognition? And what exactly is being given in such cognitions? So one could imagine Gold's imagined adversary Hilary Putnam, like a Nyayika or a Mimamsika, complaining that Stiramati is dangerously close to appealing to an indefensible magical theory of mental content. For these thinkers, one cannot imagine a tree without having been in contact with a real tree at some point. Even the content of dreams is taken by these thinkers to involve reference to real objects, objects we have seen in the past and that in dreams are juxtaposed and attributed to times and places where they are not. Dreams are mistaken because they represent things differently from how they are, but the objects represented are taken to be real. If Stiramati is going to both accept a causal theory of meaning and deny that there are any trees to come into contact with, then what Gold and Zohar would describe as the appearance of a tree could not be the appearance of a tree, or a tree-like appearance. So what is, because there is no tree, right? There's no contact of a tree. It's got to have some other content. So what is this apparent content? How is its form to be understood if the cause to which it refers is not itself represented in cognition? So the transformation, the causal nexus might cause these cognitions, but that's not what's being represented in the cognitions. So how are we supposed to understand the content? And we don't get anything like explanation from Stiramati's account. So Zohar and Gold want to be able to appeal to a different kind of causal theory of meaning to explain what individuates cognitions in terms of their content. However, this approach won't work to explain all meaning as figurative on the basis of appearances as props. The sense of a term that is supposed to differ across people while the reference stays the same would, on the Yogacara view, also be a product of the whole causal nexus that generates mental states and their content. After all, the point of religious practice is to progressively transform experience by transforming the conditions in the alaya on which it depends. But if this is so, then it would not be the case that the underlying state of the transformation of consciousness, the reference of the term, would be the same across people or the same person over time. So this is sort of a separate issue, is even if we could make sense of the content of the appearance, there's a question about whether or not, if I understand naively thinking that what causes my umbrella experience is an umbrella, presumably that I think that, or that I see that experience that way, is also a product of karma and vasana. It's a part of the alaya causal nexus. And if that's true, then it's not going to be the case that me and an enlightened person or a bodhisattva are going to have the same cognition. We're not going to be referring to the same kind of causal nexus when we use the term umbrella, precisely because the fact that we understand it differently is an indicator that there's a different set of causes that are resulting in that cognition. So sort of in conclusion, I think that Stiramati in his commentary doesn't offer a satisfactory account of appearances, and without such an account, it is unclear that Stiramati can use appearances as props in a fictionalist account without presupposing the meaning his account is supposed to explain. And this, I think this makes attributing a global fictionalist view to him problematic or implausible, but I think it also suggests that his account in general is incomplete and, contrary to Zohar's claim, doesn't constitute a systematic theory of meaning. So Zohar very boldly claims that he thinks Stiramati has a systematic theory of meaning for Yogacara, but I hope to have shown at least there are some things that still need to be explained and worked out if we're going to take this seriously as a systematic account. I think there's some holes. And perhaps some other Buddhists have things that can fill those gaps, but it doesn't seem to me that Stiramati has it worked out. And in light of these problems, I also don't think that a fictionalist construal is going to be good. And I think the main problem there is this causal account. There's this tension that would need to get resolved if we were going to try to think about it in a fictionalist way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Guerrero. Time is already over. We can invite one or two questions.
Everyone's hungry.
I would like to raise this issue regarding Alai Vijnana, mentioned in terms of storehouse and Pravritti Vijnana. Now, when they interact, then you have question about the relation between Alai Vijnana and Pravritti Vijnana. Alai Vijnana is translated as storehouse, or you can say undercurrent of a river. And Pravritti Vijnana has been compared with the ripples of the river. So, the conscious states are Pravritti Vijnana. Now, ripples of the river. And when they interact, undercurrent and all other previous Pravritti Vijnanas, they contribute to the production of a new Pravritti Vijnana. We can compare with seed. This Alai Vijnana can be compared with seeds, and Pravritti Vijnana auxiliary or upokaris. Buddhists do not have the word auxiliary, but upokaris. That means they contribute something to the production of the effect. So, these Pravritti Vijnanas, you can explain difference between fictional states and non-fictional in terms of these Pravritti Vijnanas and how they affect these Alai Vijnanas. So this is one way we can consider the distinction between them. But if Alai Vijnana itself produces, but Alai Vijnana cannot itself produce all the Pravritti Vijnanas or fictional, conscious fictional states.
Because it's recursive, is that the idea?
Because they interact. Pravritti Vijnana and Alai Vijnana, they interact. I have drawn a diagram in some of my papers how they interact with each other.
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question or your comment, I think it's a complicated. I've traced one way of explaining the sort of the causal story that goes on, but there's another way to think about it that these are actually not different, right? So the sort of the transformation or the things that are occurring in consciousness are just sort of manifestations of what is underlying, and that they're not really actually different. So this would be like sort of the three nature pivotal model, right? That they're just really three different ways of talking about the same thing, in which case they're occurring at the exact same time. And one moment is giving rise to the next one in this kind of very strongly reciprocal way. And I think that way of looking at it suggests that it is a much stronger sort of causal story. For some reason, for the reasons I cited here, I don't think you're going to get the fictionalism, because there seems to be, in order to get the norms, right, the ability to get things right or wrong, there needs to be some ability, you have to be able to get it wrong. And if the story is purely causal one, it doesn't seem that there's any moment in there where you could get it wrong. So
that will be causal story also between right and wrong, Buddhists will give some causal story because they heavily rely on causation.
Then how do the Yogacharyas explain perceptual error?
It's a really good question.
How do the Yogacharyas could explain perceptual error?
Well, they just say two fictional items are being mixed together.
It doesn't.
How do the Yogacharyas explain perceptual error?
Perceptual error?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the Yogacara answer to that, and I think you'd have to look to like Dignagar Dharmakirti to give an account of perception, but I have a non-standard interpretation of that, because I would read them as Yogacara thinkers, but I don't think you really get accounts of that in the sort of standard Yogacara text. which is, I think, why they should be read together. So I would look for the answers to that in Dignaga Dharmakirti.
That will do.
I can see that you have a concern about the causal theory, but it looks like as if one might even question the theory of causation that you are appealing to as well, from within the fictionalized account as well. So you could draw on Hume, for example, and say, well, I don't know what really the fuss is all about. Causation, there isn't really, they're just associations and so forth. So that might be one way of getting out of that concern. The second was, you invoked Mimamsa at one point alongside Nyayakas and so forth. There's sort of hard-headed realists and say, well, what does it really answer to? But Malcolm's thing on the non-referring terms and so on has kind of laid out to some extent a possibility of sort of really a more fictionalized account of what's going on for terms like Skyflower, but perhaps generalized to everything as well. I wonder if that might work here. Like Woody Allen's movie, this movie was going on, and those people there thought, oh my God, I think that I see a resemblance of me out there. But these are not the causes of that. It's just that they saw resemblance and came out to join the people. But the movie went on despite that.
I'm not sure about the Mimamsakas, just because of, nominalism and denial of universals and all that good stuff. I'm not sure you're going to be able to leverage that in order to get because the Buddhist view is a very radical one. And so I think so part of my interest in this project is resisting the attempts to try to sort of put interpretive frames on this, what is a radical project, from less radical context, and just see like, oh, we'll just slap this on and look, this works. Because the position is radical, and so a lot of these other views that have the kinds of resources that the Buddhists deny, it's hard to just sort of leverage those sources in order to use them for explanatory cases in the Mahayana Buddhist context. But I really appreciate your point about causation. In my other work, I'm really interested in pushing back against what seems to be a current trend in Buddhist studies to really try to naturalize Buddhism in a strong way that really is trying to sort of get it to fit in these causal models. Because I think precisely they have a much more conventionalist attitude towards causation itself. That makes those kinds of interpretations unlikely to be interpretively successful. Yeah. So I think it's interesting. Part of this project is way clearing to show why these things don't work in order to try to make way for thinking things differently. So thank you for that comment.
So it's time to close the session. I thank the two speakers for their two very interesting papers. And we shall be looking forward to see them published.
Thank you very much.
So thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll now break for an